Well, thank you, Franz, for that stimulating and kind of like Cynthia earlier, I don't have the right word, tender, vulnerable, heartfelt introduction to the topic. There were a couple of things I noted in the discussion that I wanted to return to, and one of them was the idea of authority. Because often it strikes me that the authority that's in question or in play is invisible. So sometimes the blaming of the victim happens from an institutional, a recognized authority, but sometimes the authority, maybe I should put that in quotes, it strikes me that the authority that's in play is whiteness. That's the authority that's being threatened and is being used to push back against the victim. Or in some other case, it might be that the authority is patriarchy. And that this is the authority that's being threatened and therefore being used to push back against a victim. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Does that track your experience?
Yeah, it does. Are you ready for us to like jump in?
Yeah, no.
Okay. Yeah, so actually, what comes to mind for me is during my time at Perkins School of Theology, I remember when Dean Lawrence was there, and there was something that he always said that stuck out for me. And he said, history informs and impacts where we are. And so I think when we look at what's happening right now, we have to always see the patterns of what has happened historically. We have to look at these systems and institutionalized racism, institutionalized sexism. There's a reason that we use those words because it's embedded in everything that we do. And so when you go to a system of authority that's supposed to help you, you have to realize you were never meant to be helped in the first place because you were never seen as a beneficiary of the system. You were always seen as an outcast of the system.
Yeah.
So for me as a woman, as a clergy woman, in a predominantly, at the time, in a predominantly white denomination, then, you know, coming up against a patriarchal system is its own thing. Coming up against a white patriarchal system is its own thing. And so when you are a woman and you're trying to assert your own agency to walk in and to say, here's what's wrong with this system. Here are all the things that you said that I should have done. Here are all the reasons why. You said to me, oh, maybe you misunderstood. Because that's oftentimes what the victim is told, that somehow you misunderstood what was happening to you. And so I think we have to start from that place of understanding what these systems are. There is a system of patriarchy. There is a system of whiteness. And so for me, one of the things that I really strive to do is to look at ways that we can talk about what it means to dismantle PMS, patriarchy, misogyny, and sexism. And it takes collective work for us to be able to do that, because women can't do it by themselves, African American people can't do it by themselves, people of color can't do it by themselves. It takes all of us to, number one, name it, call a thing, and then begin to look at what are the ways that we can constructively talk about how we can dismantle those systems. Because unless we begin to address it layer by layer and talk about the ways that we can dismantle those systems, then it's going to continue to happen, because history impacts and informs where we are.
Okay, I don't know where the mic drop icon is, but
Sorry, I might have gone into preaching mode. Sorry.
Right.
Just amen.
Well,
Amen to all of that.
yeah, I think to Yvette's point is that we can't do this alone. I mean, I think it requires people of conscience to step up and not stay in a safe place. When Dr. Martin Luther King writes his letter from the Birmingham jail, he's not writing it to the black church. He's writing it to white clergy and moderate white clergy. That's who he's writing the letter to. And I think what she's talking about, what Yvette's talking about is that for men to stay in a safe place is just, I'm going to use this word, is just as much a sin to not speak as to participate in it. And your silence allows you to participate in it. And so it's important for us. It's important to speak to what is wrong, to stand up as a man and to speak to what is wrong, as a white person to speak to what is wrong about racism, to speak into that void on behalf of the side of the vulnerable. It aligns with what the gospel calls us to do anyway. I mean, it just aligns with what the gospel calls us to do anyway. And the gospel never calls us to be silent in the face of injustice. It just doesn't. And it requires that we say something, that we speak out against it, and that we're actively involved in it. I mean, I just think about Paul's words where he says, do I sin, or the things I wish I could do. All the they always say the BD chapters, of that particular passage, but that it's do I continue to sin that grace may abound? Do I, by no means. If I do, then I'm giving myself over to this thing. I'm allowing myself to participate in it by not saying anything about it. And I think it requires us to really speak in that way. I always, I think when I think about, my role as a chaplain in healthcare, it's informed for me. I mean, it's been informed by just a very simple message of love. I mean, and I think if I'm truly going to live out my call and be all that God has called me to be, then it requires that that I live my life and that I'm seeking for others that creative redemptive goodwill, that I'm allowing myself to become an instrument of healing and peace. And if I'm silent, then I'm not an instrument of healing and peace. That sometimes it requires that I speak up. Is it without cost? No. There are times when it will cost, and it will cost, and it has cost. But as I have often heard, that's what it means to be a disciple of Christ. We all have a cost to bear. You can't bear the cross without the cost. There's a cost to it. And I think that it's important for us to know that.
One of our, not one of our guiding principle for choosing topics for these conversations was to excavate forms of covert racism. And I'm reminded why that in what you were saying about what I like to distinguish between systematic and systemic
Mhm.
So systematic is an overt strategy
Mhm.
that is implemented intentionally and overtly, whereas systemic is something that's covert and may not, at this point, in the present tense, may not actually be intentional. But because it has so worked itself into the system, into the fabric of what it is that it is, it's there and it's operating, but it's not overt on the surface of things. Um, there is systemic patriarchy still,
Mhm.
rampant in our culture.
Mm-hmm.
I don't move about intentionally in a patriarchal manner every day, but I'm still riding on top of that systemic patriarchy, and I need to be aware of it. Does that make sense? Kind of.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that again, what's hard about all these topics is that they live beneath the surface, and we don't. It's the hard work is not actually identifying the, the concept, but conscientizing it in our everyday. That I don't know that. So I'm thinking about a conversation we had that unfolded this morning in worship about uh, online devices for students in MISD. So MISD is going to provide a device for every student that does not have one at home so that they can engage in virtual learning. But they are going to charge a $20 fee for insurance for these devices. Well, now, it doesn't take a brilliant person to figure out that the very people who don't have devices at home already are the people for whom $20 is a burden.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to put the onus on the person, the responsibility, the blame on the person. But it gets even better than that, because as we unpack this discussion after worship, we have a teacher on our staff, and he said, well, last spring they handed out devices willy-nilly. They just said we got to get them in people's homes because we were all under pressure, right? There was no planning, whatnot. And so many devices were either lost or broken that we have to have some way to recover them, to pay for the replacement or the repair. Well, now this is another layer of blaming the victim, because we're saying, because of my poor planning and execution,
Mhm.
uh, some devices got broken, and now I'm going to assess a fee from you to cover the cost. Well, hello, friends. I mean, uh, that's not my problem. That you didn't have a better plan for getting these things out and getting them back, and or assessing what was broken and what was lost.
And see, I mean, I think to your point, and I think this is a really good example of when you talk about blaming the victim, and thinking about, well, there's this really good intent where you want to help. Did you invite, if you would have invited this family or this person into this conversation and say, what would be helpful? That requires energy. It requires, on my part, a willingness to be vulnerable, to give up my notion of what I think is going to be right for them, and then hear what it is that they need, and then come up with solutions together. That's what it means to be in relationship. Now, one of the things I know is that, as much as I love my wife, and she's a wonderful human being. Our relationship is work. And it takes work every day because we both come to it with our own mind and all of that. But we come to it equally, and we come sharing power, asking questions, and curious about how we can better strengthen our relationship. If we're sincere, if we're really sincere, um, and I'm saying we as in the church, if we're really sincere about really dealing um, with uh, issues of power and patriarchy and race and all of that stuff, then it really means that we have to open ourselves up um, uh, to hear from the person on the other side who has been hurt, um, and to hear honestly, and to listen honestly with a curious ear, and a heart of empathy to understand, so that the relationship is a relationship that is a give and take, and a relationship that builds justice, for it builds a just relationship for all involved.
Mhm. Well, that leads me back. I'm sorry. I was just going to say that leads me back to something that Caesar said about using the language of spiritual matters that we need to develop in the midst of what we're going through. Ways to talk about these crises as spiritual matters, not just as public health matters or economic matters or educational matters. And my second act in my life is that I've studied and become and practiced as a professional spiritual director. And so in the cases with my directees, and some of them are even clergy people, they find it very hard to use that kind of language. And so I was wondering if Caesar could speak to that a little more, about what you would envision how we go about that.
Yeah. You know, COVID. So with COVID, one of the things that I was concerned about with our staff was moral injury. That moral injury is a disruption in how we understand and see ourselves in the world, the institutions, the things that we love, how those things are disrupted. Um, and while there are these psychological components to it, what makes meaning and what connects us to these institutions, or what connects us to these particular systems, are uh, is the word love. I mean, it is the principle. It is the thing that we love, and we hold these. I mean, it's like we hold these truths to be self-evident. I mean, it's well, those are words, but those words have very deep meaning, and it is about how we structure and form our lives. Well, you know, I've always tried to figure out. I think as long as I've been in healthcare, and I always say, you cannot take care of diabetes without taking care of the spirit. That both of those things go hand in hand. And in fact, if you really want to get to the cause of the matter with this patient, then you've got to speak to the spiritual condition of that patient. It doesn't mean that you have to proselytize or do any of those things, but you have to have some spiritual language to speak to that. And I always say that chaplains are uniquely equipped to do that. And I think that the church's role is to speak to that and to bring this language back, that we talk about sin, that we talk about love, that we talk about uh, fear, that we talk about those things, because I think that is the spiritual stuff that we're dealing with. When I think about racism, and I think about patriarchy, all of that. I mean, to keep those systems in place and wanting to keep those systems in place, the thing that motivates people to keep those systems in place is fear. The antidote to fear is love. And I mean, I think that we have to have and really begin to speak about what that looks like, and how we talk about that and how we live that out every day.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, I think about the prison system. I mean, the prison system.
Yes.
The prison system was never designed when it's first put in place. It was to house black men, and anybody that was black that wasn't working, they were forced labor. I mean, all these laws that came up during Reconstruction, and the system continues to stay in place because there's this fear that there is not going to be enough. And I think that it's part of the human condition, and I think that the church is equipped, that it is our role. It's what sets us apart from any other institution, and that we can't shrink back from using that theological language to speak into the void that's happening in the world. I appreciate Black Lives Matter and what they're doing and what they stand for, but the church, it's within it's where we live. This is what we should be about. We should be about trying to bring people together, and as the scripture says, "Come, let us reason together." I mean, that's what we should be about. And I think that's our role, and we can't shrink back from that.
I want to come back to that, but Marjorie looked like she wanted to say something earlier, so I want to make sure there's space.
Well, this actually speaks more to the question of strategy. The person who wanted to know how do we respond.
Yeah.
And your answer was perfect. Call it out when you see it. But I think we have to take into account the fact that these systemic structures of white supremacy, male supremacy, are artificial constructs.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
These racial and gender distinctions do not exist in reality. Okay, there's no such thing as race. There's no such thing as bifurcated genders. Those are humanly constructed dualities, primarily white and non-white, male and non-male. And they operate out of a system of self-evidence. That is, the assumption of these structures is that this is obvious to anybody. Men and women are different. You can just see that. Black people aren't the same as white people. Open your eyes. Anybody can see that. In fact, it's only because our structures, the deep structures, have established these differences, especially dichotomous systems, that makes it seem self-evident. And the self-evidence is a weapon. The self-evidence is what keeps us from calling it out when we see it, because part of our brain says, well, but that can't be there can't be anything wrong with that. Self-evidently, white people are better than black people. Self-evidently, men are smarter and stronger than women. Self-evidently, parents can do whatever they want to their own children. But if you look at the structures that are required, the effort that is required to maintain those differences, then the fact that they're not self-evident becomes clear. That is, there are so many structures. Caesar mentioned the prison system, which is certainly one system, right, for reinforcing those self-evident differences, that people of color are more likely to be criminals. Because look at how many of them are in prison. That's a circular argument. All of the arguments are circular. But the fact is that they have this enormous weight of self-evidence. And if you've ever tried to operate a lever on a very heavy object, you will know that it requires a massive amount of energy. People who are physicists could work this out mathematically. It requires a massive amount of energy to move that object. And that's what we're doing. When we're calling this out, we are attempting to move this object, which is the weight of the self-evidence of white male supremacy, white, straight, cis male supremacy, many categories you want to put in there, that it requires this massive effort. And I don't think we should ever underestimate how much effort it's going to take to shift this boulder. It's just huge, and I'm all in favor of every strategy that we can bring to bear on it. But I don't think we should underestimate how hard it is to do the thing you recommended, which is call it out when you see it, or even before that, seeing it. Even seeing it is hard because it seems so routine.
Oh. I've been cued that that's a good end.
It was like, and that's a wrap. As much of a bow as we can put on these discussions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm reluctant to add anything, but I wanted to go back to Caesar's point. I think one, Caesar, when you were talking, and maybe this plays into the weight of self-evidence also, because I think sometimes people who, I don't know, well, it strikes me that one of the things in terms of theological categories and theological language, Cynthia, that one of the things that's coming to the surface in the COVID crisis that we don't even realize is coming to the surface is our conception of salvation and what the reconciling work of God is. Because, and where we're coming from in terms of St. Stephen and our theological position, I think it's incumbent upon us to call this out. And what I mean by this is there's an interpretation of Christianity that thinks that it is self-evident, to use Marjorie's word, that salvation is about people. And it is about personal relationships between individual people and Jesus. That's self-evident. All you have to do is read the Bible, and that's what Jesus wants, right? Jesus wants a personal relationship with me. Jesus died on the cross for me. And salvation is about whether I have accepted the Lord Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. That's one concept of salvation. If that's your concept of salvation, it doesn't actually matter if 153,000 people die of COVID. It doesn't actually matter if I wear a mask and spread the virus around. right? That's on them. Okay. The flip side of that is perhaps not so self-evident because you have to dig below the surface of the gospel and the New Testament text. And this is where our Wesleyanism, I think, is a strength for us. If you understand that salvation isn't about personal salvation only, but is about the salvation, the reconciliation of all things, that we're in this together, that there's no solitary religion, right? There is only social. Then wearing a mask becomes an imperative of the gospel, because my salvation is tied up in your salvation. My salvation is tied up in whether I spread COVID or not. Those are two very different understandings of Christianity. And I think that one of the things that's coming to surface in this is these very dichotomous understandings, because one has a strong investment in the common good, in the common weal, to use the older term, and one doesn't. Does that track with anybody? I mean,
Oh, definitely. It reminds me of the African concept of Ubuntu. I am because you are.
right.
And it is only as we are together that the world around us is created to the benefit of all. And so I think that's on point very much.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I think COVID is bringing to the surface the interconnectedness that we all have. I mean, just the fact that that we don't have a coordinated effort, and the virus is just behaving the way the virus decides to behave, and it is going through our system because some people want to wear a mask and some don't. Some are open and some are not, and doing whatever, and the virus does not care. Really highlights and shows exactly what it is that you're talking about, and brings to the surface this whole notion that that we cannot do this by ourselves.
Yeah.
That we cannot do this. In fact, we were not created to do this by ourselves. We are wired for relationship. From the day that we're born to the day that we die, we are wired for connectivity and relationship. And we were never meant to do this alone. And it sets outside the gospel to think that God just only came to save one individual, or that I have my own personal siloed salvation. I think COVID is saying to the church, and it's saying to all of us, that you can't afford to sit in your own little hub and think that you're just going to get away with it, or behave any kind of way, and you not pay the consequences to COVID. I mean, I was just thinking about Herman Cain, who was want to get. Well, I'll go ahead with politics, because I think we should throw this in here too as well, since we're having a discussion.
Okay, we're gonna have to sign off now. We're out of time. No, go ahead.
But I mean, I think this is a prime example of it, where the data, the information, how this virus operates, and yet we hang and cleave to these constructs, these human constructs, and not really pay attention to the natural properties of this virus that has no concern whether you're Republican or Democrat, black or white. It does not concern itself with that. is highlighting exactly what Greg is saying, is that it's bringing up to surface our need to be connected in connection with one another. And I'll throw this out here. So what does it say about us as the United Methodist Church when we're talking about splitting?
Yes. Yep, absolutely.
Okay. Wow.
Hello.
A friend of mine said to me last night, who knew that it would take COVID-19 to get evangelicals to say natural selection? Right.
Why that space was great.
I mean, a certain kind of evangelical, right? No, but I mean, now our topic today is blaming the victim. And I'm sure this feels off topic, but in a way, I mean, in a very real way. And I mean, this is what's so complicated about the issue. Saying, well, the virus is going to do whatever the virus is, I can't do anything about it, is a way of blaming the victim, right? Mm-hmm. It's a way of saying, I have no responsibility to take it back to Yvette's story at the very top of the last segment. No one overtly came to Yvette and said, I don't think, at least by what you described, please correct me, this is your fault that this is happening to you.
Right.
What they said was, you need to set boundaries. Right. You need to do this, which says this is your responsibility to stop the behavior. This is your responsibility to stop the perpetration.
Right, right.
Well, let's just call that out for the bullshit that it is.
Because it is.
That is blaming.
Yeah.
I mean, that is blaming. If only you had set the proper boundaries, that would never have happened to you.
Right, right.
You're blaming her, clearly.
See, again, because we associate blame with fault. I know too many people. I'm going to have too many conversations with white males, I hate to say it, who are going to say, but I didn't blame her. I didn't blame him, right? Because I didn't use the word blame, or I didn't use the word fault. And that's why I'm trying to draw this back to excavate the idea of responsibility under there, to imply that it is somehow my responsibility to protect myself from a virus alone. It's my responsibility alone to protect myself from a virus whose primary mode is community spread, from your spittle and other things. I mean, that's just asinine, and it is a way of blaming me for your behavior. We do need to wrap up our time together. When we first started this, when we had the conversation that started this series, with our social justice team and our voices of color in our community, one of the Black members of our community very pointedly looked at us all and said, so why now? Right? Why now? And I think there are a lot of possible answers to that, and a lot of valid answers to that. But I think one of them is a dog behind the chair.
Yes.
I think
she's trying to tell me it's dinner time.
Yeah. There's like an angelic glow behind
I think one of them is the coincidence of this pandemic, of COVID, and the pandemic of racism. that the pandemic of COVID has, to overuse a metaphor, excavated or torn back the veil. How about that one?
Yeah.
Opened the curtain on some things that because we have all found ourselves on equal footing in terms of a virus that doesn't recognize race or gender or class. Oh, please.
It kind of does.
Well, fair enough. But perhaps it would be fair to say, it would be accurate to say that the virus doesn't recognize it, but preconditions which we set in place
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yes.
have exacerbated, right? Become exacerbated. So yes, African Americans and Hispanics suffer at a much higher rate.
Yes.
But not because the virus likes them, but because we set up conditions
Because
over
our
time,
systems,
our
yeah.
systems, our
Yeah.
racism,
Right.
put them in a position of vulnerability. Is that fair?
Yes. Yeah, and I think you could say the same thing about the prison system.
Oh yeah.
I mean,
Healthcare system, the prison system, the school system. It's just
Yeah.
Those are topics for other.
Yeah, we have other weeks, so we'll be talking about all of those things.
Yeah.
Disparities, prison, school to prison pipeline, and
I was just about to say school to prison pipeline.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
financial disparities, lending and financial disparities. Yeah, we have whole
lending.
4 or 5 weeks, I think, on those things. So
Yeah.
Well, listen, you all have given above and beyond what I asked of you, and I really appreciate your time. And
Could I say one thing? And I know you got to wrap it up, but I want to answer the one question, because there was the one person who asked, what can I do? And I think it's important to begin with self. I think it's important to examine ourselves, to really ask questions of ourselves, and so the gentleman would ask, well, what can I do? I think the very first thing you do is you pray. You pray with an open heart and ask. You're asking, and I think, I think about my great grandmother and my grandmother and my mother, who were all prayers, and my grandmother, who, both of my parents were deaf. And I remember I used to get in fights all the time because I was always protecting my parents, and from, kids that would play the dozen. And I would like, my parents can't hear. You don't make fun of my parents not getting in fights. And my grandmother would always say to me, but Caesar, she said, I know what you're trying to do. I know what you're trying to do and trying to protect your parents. But if you want the world to change, then you have to pray. You have to pray for yourself, that God gives you wisdom and understanding while you pray for your enemies. That you're praying in a way that seeks healing and transformation, not only for yourself but for your enemy. And I think that's, it's a tough thing to pray for the other person who is diametrically opposed. I promise you, every day I wake up, I'm saying a prayer for Donald Trump. But I'm saying this prayer because what I'm praying for is that I don't let hate enter my heart and that I become part of the problem. That's what I'm praying for. And that if I can at least allow my heart to be open enough to not let it be swayed by the things that I see, but to hold true to what the gospel is continuing to call me to every day. Like my grandmother said, if you pray, God's going to change your heart, and just by the very person who you are, the world will change. So I'm not going to say anything else.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Any other closing thoughts, Yvette or Marjorie?
My final closing thought would just be for the church is that I think a lot of times when we come to the gospel, we approach it from a standpoint of looking to be comfortable and cajoled by it. But I think we have to make a decision that we're going to be challenged and convicted by it.
Mm.
Amen.
Cynthia, I don't know if you still have audio. Okay. Well, again, thank you for your time, and thank you for your presence among us and your willingness to journey with us as we try to work at addressing these issues and raising awareness and educating ourselves about. Oh, there she is. She changed.
Yeah. I had to come out to where I could plug in the computer. It used up all its juice.
Well, I was just asking if anyone had closing thoughts before we signed off. So.
One quick thing. I operate this online journal called United Methodist Insight. And at the height of the start of the COVID pandemic and the concurrent Black Lives Matter and racism, I made an editorial decision and I sent a note to all of our subscribers, and we've got about 10,000 or so. And I said, we're going to concentrate on these two matters. We're going to try not to overwhelm you, but everything has changed and we have to pay attention to this. And since I did that, we've lost about 40 or 50 subscribers who have almost, in the ones that have sent some reason for why they're leaving, it's almost uniformly blaming the victim. It's all say, well, if they didn't behave in that way, if they didn't put themselves in that position, if you just obey the police, you won't get in trouble. And I have had a hard time restraining myself from writing back and saying something, and maybe I should have. But, from now on, maybe I won't restrain myself. Maybe I'll just write back and say, that's bullshit. And
let that 8 go, Cynthia. Let that 8 go.
We'll do that way. So I just I'm so grateful to Yvette and to Caesar and to Marjorie. You've given me so much to think about today. Thank you.
One thing you can do, Cynthia, is point them to these 2 segments on blaming the victim and say, go watch these and then let's talk.
Yes, most definitely.
So
We're doing this. This is so good.
Thank you all. It wouldn't be possible without your participation and your presence and your courage. And so we appreciate that and wish you peace along the journey.
Thank you.